All right, as I mentioned, the first senator really to start sounding the alarm on this issue of the coronavirus and what was happening in China was Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton. In fact, during the impeachment hearing, he skipped part of the impeachment hearing to brief Congress on the White House, rather, on the concerns. Joining me now to talk more about this is Senator Tom Cotton of the state of Arkansas. Senator, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Hey, Tony, it's good to be back on with you.
All right, Senator, the predictions you had, the warnings that you gave, unfortunately have become true. Was Congress distracted? First, I want to start with this. Was Congress distracted by the impeachment hearing?
Tony, there's no doubt that not just Congress, but all of Washington was obsessed in January and early February with the impeachment. You're right, as you said in the lead-in, that I stepped down of the impeachment trial on several occasions, at some point for hours at a time, in conversations with administration officials up to and including the president about the severity of this outbreak that I was watching in China and the need to shut down travel with China. I discussed that with some of my Senate colleagues, and they seemed interested, but frankly, they were more focused on what Adam Schiff was saying and what the president's lawyers were saying. So there's no doubt the partisan impeachment of the president did distract attention away from the ordinary business of the Senate, and the ordinary business certainly would have been addressing a growing crisis in China that turned into a global pandemic.
Now, I know you cannot comment on classified material, but today, reportedly this afternoon, intelligence community giving a classified report to the White House that China has, in fact, underreported their numbers, putting it that way, which obviously affected our ability to respond to this in real time. Now, you also on this program back in January, or February rather, when we were talking about it, suggested that this virus may not have natural origins, that this could, in fact, have come out of a laboratory operated by the Chinese.
So, Tony, on the first point, you're correct that I cannot comment on classified reporting, but I can also tell you and your listeners you don't really need classified intelligence to see with your own two eyes and use your common sense. For example, just this weekend, China shut down all movie theaters again in their entire country after having opened them up a week ago. Does that sound like a country that feels confident that it has the virus under control? This is the exact same reason why I knew in January how serious the virus was, because China was saying they had everything under control. At the same time, they were locking in 100 million people and shutting down schools nationwide. So the propaganda from the Chinese Communist Party, on the one hand, contrasted with their actions on the other hand, tell you that China is, of course, still lying to this day. On the second point about the origins of this virus, we know that the Chinese Communist Party's first origin story is false. They claim that it came from a food market in Wuhan. Chinese researchers published in The Lancet in January demonstrated that of the original 40 cases, 14 had no contact with that food market. So you might say the virus went into the market before it came out of the market. Now, I still don't know. No one, to my knowledge, knows in America where that virus came from. We don't even have to take the jump to make the claim that it is an artificial virus or that it has been engineered. There are perfectly good reasons, for instance, for any laboratory to be researching a coronavirus, especially in that part of the world. You could simply observe that we know that laboratories in Wuhan were, in fact, researching coronaviruses, and Chinese laboratories have a history of sloppy and negligent safety practices to raise the question and demand answers from China, because they have not been forthcoming. And in fact, everything they say and do suggests that they have engaged in a cover-up, to include kicking out American reporters. That's why it's so important that we continue to demand answers to this question.
So, Senator, where we stand today, over 200,000 cases of coronavirus here in the United States, 4,000 deaths across the country. Whether or not this was a manufactured virus, whether it just innocently escaped because, as you said, sloppy practices, or was intentional, I'll put that aside. But is this not a kind of a wake-up call to the United States from a standpoint of what could happen if something like this was intentionally released?
Yes, Tony, and it's a wake-up call, too, of just how untrustworthy the Chinese Communist Party is, and just what a bad detour we have taken over these last 30 years. And outsourcing so much of our manufacturing capacity to China and integrating our economies. Now, your listeners know just how evil Chinese communists can be. They have forced abortions on their own people. They have demolished churches. They run gulags of religious minorities in their northwest hinterlands. Most Arkansans know that as well, and they realize that the time has come to reassess our relationship with China. That's a wake-up call that most Americans know, and it's time for our business and media leaders to understand.
That last point, the business community. I don't know that I have time to go into that, but when we look at, you talk about the camps that are housing the Uyghurs, and now we have reports saying that they are using them as forced labor, dispersing them across the country into plants that, if not operated by, are certainly the U.S. companies benefit from the cheap products produced with forced labor. I mean, this relationship between America's business community and China is certainly not strengthening America.
No, it's not strengthening America. It's devastated so many of our manufacturing communities, and now it is time to fundamentally reassess that. You know, if you're any further up on the manufacturing value chain than cheap plastic toys or lawn chair, it's time to reassess whether you should have any facilities located in China. We need to bring that capacity back to the United States, or at least work to move it to countries that are friendly to us.
Now, let me ask you a question. You mentioned that we're seeing for a second wave where they're closing down theaters and stuff. We know they did that back in January. In fact, that was one of the points that you watched and said there's something going on here because of their draconian measures that they had taken, locking down 75 million people, closing down the schools, businesses, arresting people, welding doors shut, just really extreme. You said at that point that obviously something was going on. Was that because of how bad it was or how bad they thought it might become?
To me, Tony, it was both. The fact that they were saying they had it under control, but they were taking these extreme measures, demonstrated that they were already fearful of what had happened. They knew the true number of cases and deaths, and they also realized just how contagious it could become. Wuhan's an important city in central China, a manufacturing and transportation hub, but it's nothing compared to Beijing and Shanghai and Hong Kong. So it was a combination of both what had already happened in China, I believe, and also what the Chinese communists were trying to prevent happening in other even bigger and more vital metropolitan areas in China.
Now, the president, as you had communicated to him back during the impeachment trial, the hearing in the Senate, you said he was on this. He understood it. He took some actions, but he was getting some of his economic advisors not as aggressive as his security folks. But you said that he has taken action and taken decisive action to deal with this.
That's right, Tony. I've got to say, too many of these public health bureaucrats, whether they're in our government or in the WHO, gave very bad advice about travel restrictions. It's just a knee-jerk reaction they have against these kinds of restrictions. We saw it in 2014 with Ebola in West Africa again. A lot of the president's economic advisors also worried about the economic impact of slowing down travel with China, a concern that seems kind of quaint these days. The president's security advisors agreed with me, and they were recommending to slow down or shut down and travel. And the president, in the end, to his credit, made that decision, even though it wasn't very popular at the time. He got a lot of criticism, to include Joe Biden, calling it hysterical and xenophobic, to give you a sense of how different things would look if Joe Biden were our president.
Are you comfortable that the administration, as best as possible, has a handle on where we are and where we're going with this?
Right now, yes, the daily press conferences that the president is holding with his coronavirus task force are very informative. They keep people up to date. They don't sugarcoat it either. Just yesterday, the president acknowledged that we're in for some very, very painful days ahead, but we're taking the measures we are to protect our fellow citizens, especially the most vulnerable among them, and to try to ensure that we spread out the number of infections we have, so our hospitals and our great doctors and nurses can handle that surge and patients coming in, not just from coronavirus, but from their ordinary
Right.
business as well. What we don't want to see is the kind of scenes that you have in Italy and Spain, where the elderly or the infirm are being denied ventilators and instead administered last rites.
Yeah, it's so important. Senator Tom Cotton, as always, great to have you on the program. Thanks so much for taking time to join us this afternoon.